Hey guys, what's up? How's everyone doing? A very good afternoon. There's currently 8 viewers in the chat, so I'm gonna maybe wait till 3:05 and then I shall continue with the lecture. Just give a few minutes for people to join up. If everyone can hear me clearly, could you please just drop a message onto the chat? If not, I would have to make some changes. All right, okay. Very good morning and afternoon to anyone that's watching from wherever. My name is Karan Chauhan. I am a third year medical student and I shall be delivering a lecture on the autonomic nervous system as a part of physio for you guys. Now, when I had this lecture as an anatomy subject in the first year, I was given this lecture to me by a sixth year, and he had stressed the importance of this subject for all the coming years in medical school. So I would like you guys to understand that grasping the concept of the autonomic nervous system is possibly one of the most helpful things you could do for yourself, because next semester's physio, when you dive into organ systems and specific organ systems, you shall notice that the autonomic nervous system with its parasympathetic and sympathetic is almost everywhere. So it would do you well to even brush past the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, which I shall do briefly. And basically, I just want you all to grasp the concept and understand how it helps and functions the body. So we're going to continue now and start. There's 8 people in the chat, so let's do it. Okay. Today, this is the structure for the lecture. We're going to go through the learning outcomes, study sources, exam questions, overview, then move on to sympathetic, parasympathetic, enteric, specific organ systems, and I'm not going to go too much into detail because you don't require that right now for this semester. But come next semester, you definitely need to, go into each system properly. All right, so by the end of this, I hope and pray that everyone is, familiar with the concept and functioning of the ANS, and also that, if I'm not wrong, a couple of you have the robot test for this topic in the next week or two, so hopefully I can help you with that too. And just some study tips and guides from personal experience. Always gather your material in time, and that is like organization of I want to study from this textbook, these notes, etc., etc. Seek advice from upper year students. Honestly, my first year was thoroughly like I could only pass it thoroughly due to what my seniors helped me with. So definitely seek advice from them. Discover what study methods work best for you. Now, that is possibly one of the best advices I wish I had gotten before I joined medical school, because I didn't understand how my brain needed to, store information in the most effective way possible. So nowadays, I'm sure there's n number of methods for you to even find out what study methods work best for you. But trial and error for sure works the best. So just go ahead and search videos or make flashcards or make spaced repetition patterns, anything that can help you with being effective and not having to work hard per se. Don't be dissuaded by bad advice. Sadly, at this university, you get to hear a lot of conflicting views about examiners and exams themselves. So all I want to say is just take everything with a pinch of salt, because at the end of the day, it matters more about how much effort you put in. Stay consistent, disciplined, and as cliche as that sounds, that possibly is the only way medical students stay on top of their stuff, by staying consistent and sticking to a plan. Study sources for especially autonomic nervous system, I used the Guyton's textbook, which is this one right here. For anyone that doesn't know, you can also use Boron's or Costanzo, any one of the books that you find helpful for yourself. But personally, I stick to Guyton's. And I would say stick to one textbook, according to me at least. There's plenty of notes on the MIMSA Hub and final exam documents prepared by students. So you should be covered with that. IS lecture slides for a very brief overview, because they aren't enough knowledge for the final exam. And of course, last but not the least, I'm sure by now, since you've all been through anatomy, you must have heard of Dr. Najib and, well, Ninja Nerd, various other YouTube people. So yeah, just search up the topic on YouTube and you should find plenty number of videos. This is the question, the actual final exam question that I'm going to be covering today. If I'm not wrong, it's I think in the section B, but right now, honestly, you guys don't really have to worry about this stuff. I'm just putting it in for future reference so that you guys can, tick yourself off and make sure you've finished everything that you need to do. All right, starting with the lecture itself. Now, when you think of the nervous system, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? For me, it's just signaling. It's my brain and my body being in coordination somehow with some sort of language. Sadly, we don't have like Wi-Fi inside our bodies, so we can't really send signals without having a wired connection, which is where the nervous system comes in. So essentially, all it is an interplay of anticipating a certain stimulus and having a certain response towards that stimulus. Now, how does that happen? Anticipation is a very higher order brain thinking skill. So it has everything to do with how your higher cortex functions, which is with your limbic system, your amygdaloid complex, your the forebrain system, the reticular formation, all of this. So you have a sensor, which is what is being input into you, which can be any sort of stimulus. Maybe it's just extreme cold or a fire or almost anything can be regarded as a stimulus. When we have an actual stimulus that gets that has an actual physical response to our body, our brain has already sort of anticipated that with time. All of these informations from different places get integrated in the CNS, and an output is produced. Now, this output can be an actual mechanical reaction, which is moving away from maybe a stressful situation or a really hot pipe. You don't want to touch that, so your body is going to tell you, no, we need to move away. That's your output. And all of these things have to do with deciding a certain behavior in the CNS, and then that being, put out into the world as a response. And before I move on, there's two things that I'd like you all to understand in terms of terminology. Up and down regulation versus positive and negative feedback. So, what is up and down regulation? Now, when a certain stimulus has an effect on the body, then there's also a product produced. Now, when we have something that is some original stimulus that is producing a certain product, which is then going and influencing the original stimulus to produce that certain chemical even more, that is positive feedback, which in the body has not a lot of examples, but one of the most important examples for us is during labor. None of us would be able to be, born perfectly without positive feedback from oxytocin, which is the brain's, release the baby hormone. Negative feedback is essentially when there is an original stimulus causing an original response, but the product of that response is going and telling the original stimulus to stop doing what it's doing, which is essentially negative feedback. Negative feedback can be, the most simple that I can think of is when you're eating food, you eat to a certain point where your stomach is full, it's distended, and it's like, okay, you know what, we can't take any more. It sends out signals. So it tells the brain, okay, it tells the hunger center of the brain that, guys, we're done. We don't need any more food. We have enough glucose. We have enough nutrients. We're fine. We're good. That's when it's negative feedback, and it's like the brain is the feeding center of the brain is like, okay, we don't need to eat anymore. Up and down regulation is mainly on the molecular level, where we have up regulation, which is increasing the frequency or the intensity of a stimulus, or the response, which is a certain receptor in the body. So to increase that, as in increasing the number of receptors or increasing the frequency of the stimuli, etc. Down regulation is exactly the opposite, which is taking down the numbers. So why I'm telling you this is because these two different terminologies are more often than not always interspersed, and that usually leads to teachers being confused. So I really want you guys to understand that up and down regulation versus positive and negative feedback are two not completely separate and different things, but two different things in terms of terminology. Okay, homeostasis. Now, what is homeostasis? It's essentially just the maintenance of an internal environment with a certain set point for a temperature, for pH, for ionic balance, for anything else that I could think of, but I can't right now, so it's okay. And these adjustments within a cell are called homeostatic regulation. Now, regulation in the human body is of three main types. That is systemic, local, and auto. So systemic, from the word itself, it's something that would have an effect on the whole body. So that has mainly two parts, which is the humoral and nervous regulation. Humoral, which is endocrine, from the hypothalamus and the hypophyseal portal systems, and n number of other organs as well. But that's all for endocrine physio, which we're not going to get into. Nervous regulation, which is the autonomic nervous system. And local regulations are just in a certain area with around surrounding certain tissues, looking at chemical regulation, PCO2, PO2, pH, etc. Autoregulation, again, mainly in the myocardium because blood flow causes changes in the perfusion pressure in the heart. There's homeometric and heterometric autoregulation, which you guys will learn next semester, so I'm not going to get into that right now. But what we're going to focus on today is the nervous regulation aspect. Now, our nervous system is essentially divided, motor nervous system is essentially divided into somatic and autonomic. Somatic, from the word itself, soma, which is the word root, means body. Bodily, actions which are completely under voluntary control are what somatic nervous system encompasses. So essentially it's me deciding in my head, okay, I want to move my arm up or I want to push this box away. Voluntary system. Skeletal muscle connections, there is a direct connection from the CNS to the effector organ, which is more often than not skeletal muscles, through neuromuscular junctions. So pretty basic, nothing more to it. There's no real major stops in between the transportation of the impulse. Whereas when we move to autonomic nervous system, also called the involuntary nervous system, is essentially what our body has no control over in terms of conscious control. So I can't think in my mind, okay, I want to increase my heart rate and it'll actually happen. Of course not. So the autonomic system is something that has developed in humans over a very long period of time. Evolution, behavioral characteristics, survival of the fittest, etc., etc. All of these things have something innate to do with the autonomic nervous system. It has most of its effects are on the visceral body, which is basically the inside. So most of the internal organs, most of the vasculature, and definitely most of the glands. Now, one difference between the somatic versus autonomic system is that autonomic system have ganglia between the CNS and the actual effector. Now, these ganglions are basically accumulation of the cell bodies where they have to relay. So one neuron coming from CNS to a certain checkpoint or a ganglia, where it synapses onto a second relay neuron, which then goes and actually takes the signal to the effector. Okay, yeah, just basically recapturing the same idea. Preganglionic, yes, okay. So preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons are essentially what I was talking about. So in the autonomic nervous system, it largely, regulates most of the bodily functions such as heart rate, urination reflexes, sexual arousal, respiration, even production of certain hormones, etc., etc. So the autonomic nervous system is divided into three major parts: sympathetic, parasympathetic, and a third which most people usually don't consider to be its own nervous system, but it essentially is, which is the enteric system, which is for the GIT tract. Sympathetic part, in just a very brief, is any activity related with fight or flight responses, whereas parasympathetic is more rest and digest. That is how I remembered it, because honestly, guys, like, a lot of medicine has to do with memorization, and I know it's not as fun as most other things, but if you can somehow come up with really, comical ways to remember things, it'll help you. So make mnemonics, make whatever you can to remember certain things, but at the end of the day, you have to remember a few things. The enteric system I will get to, but essentially it's just the wall of the gastrointestinal tract, from all the way from the esophagus to the rectum. Okay, again, something about terminology. In the nervous system, there's two major types of modalities, which is afferentation and efferentation. Now, afferentation the word starts with the letter A, which you'd usually think of as away, as in going away, taking away. But in this case, it's flipped. Afferentation is when something is brought to you from an environment. Efferentation, which is something that we are responding with towards the environment. So afferentation, getting something; efferentation, putting it out and responding to it. Now, most of the ANS nerves have both afferentation and efferentation. So afferent sensation conducts basically in the ANS all the visceral sensations, which is if I feel a nausea, if I feel stomachache, if I feel like there is, a spot in my lower abdomen that is paining extremely hard, or I haven't gone to the toilet in a while and I really need to urinate. All of these feelings that we have and these sensations that we gain are all from the afferent fibers in the ANS system. Now, efferent causes visceromotoric responses, and again, none of these are under your control. The brain just knows exactly what to do. All right, now guys, this slide, you just entirely have to memorize, because there are certain robot questions directed at the neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. So in a somatic system, which is voluntarily controlled, we have, as you can see, no ganglion in between, straight from the CNS all the way to the effector organ. And the neuromodulator or mediator is acetylcholine, and it always ends up on nicotinic receptors. Now, sympathetic has preganglionic and postganglionic, just like parasympathetic, but there's just one small difference. In parasympathetic system, the pre- and postganglionic neurons use acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, whereas in the sympathetic system, preganglionic still using acetylcholine, but once it relays onto the ganglion, and the postganglionic fiber extends out, those fibers are all noradrenaline specific. Noradrenaline, adrenaline, any two. And the receptors are completely different, which makes sense. If I have a certain different molecule, I'm going to have a different receptor as well. So there's alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, which I should get into. But there is one very major, discrepancy in the sympathetic system, which is the postganglionic innervation of the sweat glands. Now that one is just like the parasympathetic system, wherein it's using acetylcholine to be the neuromodulator. This is possibly, I think, Miss Novakova's, even Mr. Professor Babula, even a good few professors asked this question, and if you're able to say that, there is one exception where acetylcholine is a postganglionic sympathetic neuromodulator, say it. Sweat glands, remember that. So yeah, the nicotinic receptors, cover that, and muscarinic receptors for the parasympathetic system. I've just attached a few pictures now as well for you guys to just go over and essentially memorize, because there really isn't much I can teach you about these things. But I'm sure from anatomy you guys do still remember that there is, the sympathetic preganglionic fibers are much shorter, whereas parasympathetic fibers, preganglionic, much longer. The reason for that is because, well, we have a sympathetic chain and intramural ganglions for parasympathetic systems. So getting on to that, Yeah, this is just a review again. You have all the different receptors, all the different types as well, which you sadly just have to memorize for now. I promise it'll make a lot more sense next semester when you're actually going to be using a lot more of these terminologies all the time. Norepinephrine, postganglionic sympathetic, adrenergic receptors. Now, one major difference is that the acetylcholine nicotinic receptors are mainly ligand-gated channels, wherein they use ions like sodium, potassium, and calcium to create a change between the ionic composition inside and outside, which leads to a certain change. Whereas in norepinephrine and adrenergic receptors, they are G protein coupled receptors. And I'm sure you've heard of G proteins from biology. But basically, whenever the signal molecule or a ligand gets attached to the extracellular receptor, there is a host of other changes that follow after intracellularly. And currently, I don't think you guys need to know the exact pathway of these G-coupled proteins, but next semester, if I'm not wrong, I think you're gonna for sure. So for now, it's okay, don't have to worry about it. Alpha type and beta type receptors. Alpha type, generally excitatory, but exceptions in the GIT, whereas beta type, generally inhibitory, except the heart, which is one of the most important things that you need to remember. Okay, brain centers and the autonomic nervous system. Now, as you can see, a lot of whatever I'm talking about has to do with the CNS combining with the spinal cord and all the different ganglia to produce a certain response. Now, how does that happen? So, in the brain, we have certain centers and nuclei that control certain functions and homeostatic regulations of the body. As you can see, in the hypothalamic region, we have the heat control, water balance, feeding control, urinary bladder control, pneumotaxic center, which has to do with the normal breathing, cardiac acceleration, vasoconstriction, cardiac slowing, respiratory center. Now, for now, I don't think you guys need to memorize exactly where these centers are in the brainstem and in the hypothalamus, but next semester, I think you're going to be required to. So I won't get into too much detail, but all I want you guys to remember is that there's a lot of these centers in the brainstem and in the hypothalamus that essentially receive information from every different type of signal that the body can produce. So if I'm in a desert and it's scorching hot and I am dehydrated, I haven't had water, I haven't had food, heat control is going to be completely activated and it's going to be telling the body, okay, we need to sweat profusely to get out all this, all the ionic imbalances. We need to dilate our, vasculature so that we have a lot more heat loss, etc., etc. So basically, all I'm trying to make you guys understand and grasp the concept of is that all of this has to do with us reacting to a certain environment or a stimulus. And the body does that beautifully through all the connections and various, signals that the CNS and brainstem receive. And after which they understand the information, they understand the situation that the body is in. They then work with all the other brain centers and, cortex functions and come up with a response, which is then relayed down from the brainstem into the spinal cord and then, has its effect. Yeah, most of the regulations unconscious originate from the hypothalamus. Strong emotional experiences and strong emotional memories can definitely trigger autonomic responses. So I'm pretty sure you all must have seen how babies are. And babies really don't understand the concept of danger and survival at their age. So a lot of a lot of all these autonomic responses we teach ourselves. If I'm in a situation where I'm like, I know I'm going to be nervous for a while, I know I'm going to be scared to do this, my heart is going to start racing. So I've taught myself to do that. And more often than not, it's sympathetic activation. Like a strong emotional experience would be entering an exam hall for the first time. So you know for a fact that your heart is racing, and that's all due to the sympathetic nervous system. The hypothalamus is also known as the master control of the responses elicited, because it is one of the key centers for the autonomic nervous system, wherein, again, takes in information from the higher centers, from sensations, from viscerosensation, from proprioception, from all the different types of modalities, and then integrates the information, decides what to do with it, processes it, and then relays it downwards for an actual behavioral change, which leads to maintenance of homeostasis at the end of the day. Functions of the hypothalamus: regulation of the ANS and endocrine system through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal system, regulation of food and water intake and excretion. Exactly. Regulation of food is done, again, food intake has entirely to do with hormones like leptin and adiponectin. Water intake and excretion has everything to do with the renal system. So regulation of body temperature, again, vasculature, like I said before, sweating, heart rate, etc., etc. Biological clock, the circadian rhythm, if you've not heard of it, is what most people are, hardwired with. That I wake up in the morning and I sleep in the evening, and that's for a reason as well. The circadian rhythm is influenced because of the sunlight, and sunlight keeps us awake. Again, entirely the ANS function. Immediate and long-term behavioral regulations. Now this is the interesting part. So if I'm walking down the street and I can see a car speeding towards me, my immediate survival and behavior is to, my immediate behavior for survival is to jump out of the way, for sure. That has everything to do with sympathetic nervous system. Long-term behavioral regulations, like in maternity, in situations where we know we have to, last this out in the long term, our ANS system is working profusely just for us to get out of stressful situations like that. So, how does the hypothalamus get information like that? So, this is just a few examples. There's a lot more, but let me just go through them slowly. Nucleus of the solitary tract contains almost all visceral sensory information from the vagus nerve and relays it to the hypothalamus, which then has target and effector organs. Information including heart rate, blood pressure, gut distension, renal, glomerular filtration, etc., etc. Reticular formation. Now, as it says in the presentation, it's a catch-all nucleus in the brainstem that receives almost every type of modality from the spinal cord. The retina, like I said, the light and dark cycle has everything to do with the optic nerve, the retina, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which I shall get to. The limbic and olfactory systems. Now, the limbic system is basically everything that humans have developed emotionally. It has most of your survival instincts, and the most basic human instincts are controlled by the limbic system. Aggression, sexual reproduction, and powerful in situations where I need to be in power, situations where I need to run, situations of n number of different types. Limbic system. Amygdala, hippocampus, olfactory cortex, all of these work together and form pathways, essentially, whenever we do a certain action. Now, the beauty of all this is that the brain is not just a a blueprint that just works like this and then forgets everything. We remember a lot of the information that we have from living a normal daily life. Um, the limbic system also has a lot to do with memory and how certain, stimuli should elicit certain responses from the body. Moving on to the sympathetic nervous system in detail. Okay, so again, fight or flight mobilizes the body, keeps us in a situation where if I need to run, my body is capable of doing so. Or if I need to fight, my body is capable of doing so. How? Increases arterial pressure, starting with increasing in the cardiac rate. So we have the heart pumping much faster, so that there's way more blood being supplied to all around the body, and specifically being supplied to the muscles, because fight or flight situation entirely physical. We need our muscles to back us up. Increases metabolic rate, increases blood glucose concentration. Now that is very important. Glycemia is a very tricky concept in the parasympathetic and sympathetic system. But for now, all I'm going to say is, you know how the heart, even though it has almost every little drop of blood that passes through the body passes through the heart. It is a banker controlling a lot of money, blood, but it also needs its own salary. So when we have increased arterial pressure, that also causes increased pressure in the coronary arteries, which leads to greater perfusion of the heart, which leads to even better pumping, and so on and so forth. That's exactly how our body is able to manage stressful situations. The blood supply is also diverted mainly to the brain, so that our mental state is active and alert. The sympathetic preganglionic neurons are located in the intermediolateral column of the spinal cord from the level of T1 to L2 or L3, and that is also one of the reasons why it's called the thoracolumbar division of the ANS. The ganglions are either in the sympathetic chain or in the paravertebral or prevertebral chain, which is basically connecting interganglionic branches. There's also transmural ganglia, which is wherein the ganglia are located inside the wall of an organ. Yeah, so these are the different types of connections that the sympathetic trunk can have. They all originate in the intermediolateral thalamic nuclei, and exit out as white communicating branches. When they finally reach the sympathetic chain, they relay on a different neuron, and then that different neuron then goes out of the sympathetic chain and innovates whatever it needs to innovate. So this is a direct exit of a neuron, which is at the level of the vertebra. There's a sympathetic chain, goes out, innovates whatever visceral sense it needs to. Interganglionic branches are the ones that don't synapse in the ganglion at the vertebral level, but instead go downwards or go upwards. And all of these interganglionic branches is the reason why the brain is able to get information from such far off places in the body. These are the visceral and vascular branches, like the cardiac nerves, carotid nerves, prevertebral ganglia going to splanchnic nerves, etc., etc. So I'm just touching up a little bit on the anatomical perspectives of sympathetic nervous system, so that you guys can understand that the thoracolumbar system, sympathetic, craniosacral, involving the cranium and the sacral plexus, parasympathetic. Sympathetic fibers are type C fibers or slow pain fibers, as I remember it. They extend from all the skeletal nerves and control blood vessels, sweat glands, piloerector muscles of the hair, other visceral senses from different organ systems. And yeah, that's essentially it for the sympathetic system. Moving on to the parasympathetic, as I said earlier, rest and digest, prevalent in routine situations and situations where I'm at rest, essentially like how I'm doing right now. The direct effect is it decreases heart rate, constricts coronary arteries, which is what supplies the heart itself with blood. Decreases cardiac output. Of course, if I decrease the heart rate, I'm going to have a decreased cardiac output. Bronchoconstriction, because we don't need to be inhaling and exhaling and ventilating with such intensity. Increased GIT motility, so that we can digest our food and assimilate all the nutrients and continue living. Stimulates saliva secretion, normal, understandable. We're about to eat. Even before you actually take the first bite of food, you're already salivating. And how does that happen? Anticipation from the parasympathetic nervous system. The preganglion neurons of the parasympathetic division have their cell bodies in either the brainstem from certain nuclei, specifically the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, which is oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. They all have parasympathetic fibers. And additionally, from the sacral system, we have the 2 to 3 sacral spinal nerves that innervate the lower urinary tract and genital tract. Now, one very really interesting concept is that 75% of every bit of parasympathetic innervation is through the vagus nerve. Now, if that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what can, because the vagus nerve is a nerve that starts in the brainstem and somehow supplies the heart, the lungs, and GIT, a little bit of the intestinal systems. So there's a reason it's called the vagus nerve, or the wandering nerve in Latin. This is just a table representing the ganglions and their location and what they innervate. As you can see, oculomotor nerve innervates pupil, but the ganglion is ciliary ganglion, so it has to relay off of that. Facial nerve, pterygopalatine, submandibular ganglions for all the different glands in our nasooral cavity. Glossopharyngeal, otic ganglion, parotid salivary gland. So all of this leads to increased salivation and increased production of these glands. Okay, and finally, there's just some few pictures that I've attached for you guys to briefly overview like every single anatomical, connection of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And yeah, so as I said earlier, superior cervical ganglion in the sympathetic system. There's the celiac plexus, superior mesenteric plexus, inferior mesenteric plexus. Now, these are all, not the sympathetic chain. The sympathetic chain is all right here. So these branches and these nerves go and actually firstly synapse for the first time onto these plexuses, and then go and innervate whatever they were supposed to. Yeah, the same parasympathetic. I would also advise you all to remember these nuclei, because it does make a difference if you're trying to go for the A in an exam, then you want to be absolutely 100% with every single neuron connection, starting from the nucleus. As you can see, parasympathetic 3, 7, 9, and 10. 10, vagus nerve supplying the heart, the bronchial tree, the stomach, small intestine, parts of the large intestine, and then we have the splanchnic nerves, which innervate the rest: urinary bladder, genital system, etc. All right, moving on to the enteric nervous system. Now, it's considered the second brain of the body, because there's the amount of fibers in the enteric nervous system is almost equal to the whole autonomic nervous system. So it is a very vast and extensive network, divided into two, basically, the submucosal and the enteric plexus. Submucosal, from the name itself, lies in the submucosa, also called the inner plexus, and it's located between the circular muscle and the lumen. It senses the ionic balances and the nutrient balance in the lumen, and regulates the blood flow and secretion. My enteric plexus, the outer plexus, also called Auerbach's plexus, is located between the longitudinal circular layers of the muscle. I'm sure you know from histology the same, so I'm sure this is just a revision, but yeah, it is involved in the control of gastrointestinal movement. So my enteric, muscular, movement, makes sense. Submucosal, it's actually, in contact with the submucosa, so it's going to be able to understand the secretions and the flow of the lumen, etc., etc. So it has more to do with blood flow and secretion. Okay, interplay of ANS in specific organ systems. Now, I told you before I finally end this lecture, I would briefly go over a few organ systems that you don't fully need right now, but I'm sure the exam, like the robot test, has a few questions related to a few organ systems. So I'm just going to go over that too. ANS in the cardiovascular system. Sympathetic, heart rate increase, contractility increase, conductivity increase. Parasympathetic, exact opposite. How? There is an SA node, AV node. Electrical activity, pacemaker of the heart. Maintains the electrical discharge, which leads to the contraction. So it's innervated both from the vagus nerve as a parasympathetic division and from the sympathetic trunk as sympathetic innervation. Now, both of these modalities are working in synchronous fashion to control the heart rate. But supposing I'm in a situation where I'm walking through a forest and I see a snake, I'm going to want to, start running the other way. So that's when the sympathetic nervous system is going to be in full flow. It's going to be increasing its discharge into the sinoatrial node, leading to increased action potentials, leading to increased contraction, leading to a lot more blood being pumped out of the heart and into the whole body. So pretty self-explanatory, pretty basic understanding, but I'm just trying to think if there's anything else I could add for you guys in the cardiovascular system. No, not really. Okay. One thing, sorry. The sympathetic innervation of the heart is more predominant in the ventricular myocardial region, because the contractility is what increases blood flow. There's nothing, we can't really reduce the size of the muscle of the heart, which is what you think a parasympathetic system could do. So on the heart, there's a lot more sympathetic receptors than parasympathetic, because it's under sympathetic regulation more often than not. How does the heart sense changes like these? Baroreceptor reflex. So we have these little, cells, balls of cells, that are receptors that respond to pressure changes. Baroreceptors are placed in the bifurcation of the carotid and in the arch of the aorta. So we have baroreceptors and chemoreceptors alike in both places, but for the purpose of this lecture, we're going to be focusing only on the baroreceptors. What do? Sense a change in the pressure in arteries. So if I'm in a situation where I'm in hypertension or I'm in elevated blood pressure, let's go with that. My arteries all around are going to feel the change, but the one that is going to inform us of the increased blood pressure are because of these baroreceptor reflexes. So the arteries stretch, the baroreceptors start increasing their firing rate. Now, these baroreceptors are connected to the vagus nerve all the way to the CNS. The cardioinhibitory center is stimulated, which should lower the blood pressure, and the vasomotor center is also inhibited. Both of these lead to reduced sympathetic tonus, leading to either reduced heart rate or vasodilation, which then finally gives us what we need to attain to maintain homeostasis, which is reduced blood pressure. Now, the same can work in the opposite fashion. If we are in a case of hypertension, less arterial pressure, less stretch on the endothelium, less stretch on the baroreceptor, so baroreceptor stops firing at the intensity that it was used to. The efferent sympathetic firing increases, heart rate increases as a response because of adrenaline, contractility increases, blood pressure increases, cardiac output increases. At the end of the day, all that we need to make sure is the cardiac output being, increased or decreased in parasympathetic versus sympathetic. Vascular tone. So most of the vasculature in our body is under the sympathetic regulation, wherein it can vasoconstrict and vasodilate depending on the situation. One of those situations is in heat. If I am in a situation an environment that is extremely hot, I need to lose this excess heat being formed. So my blood vessels would dilate, leading to better convection, better losses through conduction, anything. If I'm in a cold area, I need to preserve every bit of heat that I can get. So my vessels are going to start constricting so that there's less heat loss. ANS in the urinary bladder. So sympathetic system leads to the detrusor muscle, which is the muscle of the urinary bladder, relaxation of that, and the internal sphincter starts to contract. Parasympathetic regulation, detrusor contraction, and sphincter relaxation. So once the detrusor starts contracting, we start feeling the urge and sensation to urinate. We have an internal sphincter and an external sphincter. The internal sphincter is the one that's under control of the autonomic nervous system, but the external sphincter is under our voluntary control, but over a period of time, because babies can't really, hold their urine for too long, whereas adults, we're trained to. So, internal sphincter, remember that. I should have put that into the PPT, but just for knowledge sake. Lastly, ANS in the pupil. The pupil is also under the control of both parasympathetic and sympathetic, but you think that if I need to lead to a contraction or a constriction of something, or something that leads to more work, you'd think sympathetic. But in the pupil, it's different. In the pupil, constriction is caused by parasympathetic system as opposed to sympathetic. Whereas in the situation where I'm in the complete dark, my sympathetic system is going to be way more active to dilate my pupil so that there's more light getting into my eyes, so that I can see whatever I want to see. Essentially, that is the end of my lecture. And if you have any questions, I can answer them now. Please put them into the chat. I will wait till 4 o'clock, and after which I shall end the lecture. So if you have any questions, just drop them in right now. If not, I'm available on Instagram, Facebook, anything, wherever you want to reach me, and I shall answer your questions whenever I can. I shall also be uploading the lecture onto the MIMSA Hub, so you guys can just find that there after the lecture. No questions? Okay, fine. Cool. Thank you so much for your attention, guys. And I hope I've helped in whatever aspect I could. And I wish you always all the best of, all the very best for your robot test coming up. And yeah, if you need any help, I'm right here. Bye-bye, guys. See you.